Well, you have to go back to the Civil War. You have to remember that that according to the Constitution, slavery was legal. And the Emancipation Proclamation, over which much is made, was an act of military necessity. There were still 800,000 slaves in border states and elsewhere that were not freed. So when the war was over, the Constitution had to be amended to make slavery illegal. But then there was another problem, because as part of the organization of the United States of America, the South was given extra political power for every slave that they possessed. They got 3/5 of a vote. And that vote allowed them, with a population much less than the North, to virtually control the country. Except when immigrants began to come in the 1840s, what's then called the West, that land region between Appalachia and the Mississippi River, became the tipping point. And there were many schemes, just confiscation of Mexico, move into Central America to try and maintain slave power. But then the war came. The problem is, once you make slavery illegal, then instead of getting 3/5 of a vote, the South would get a whole vote. Lincoln is assassinated, Johnson becomes president, he amnesties the Confederates, they create new governments, and they return to Congress the vice president of the Confederacy and a zillion Confederate generals. So the Republican Party has a problem. The problem is they will have won the war and are about to lose control of the government again. In the meantime, you have wide-scale mayhem, murder in the South, a return to slavery under what is called the Black Codes. And so the Republican Party forbade these former Confederates from sitting, and then they passed the Reconstruction Acts. They put the southern states under military control, and then they franchised 1.5 million loyal citizens, 800,000 blacks, 700,000 whites. And when the election then came in 1868, Grant won by 400,000 votes. Had the blacks who had been newly enfranchised not been enfranchised, 3 years after the Civil War, the Democratic Party, which was the party of the slave power, might have won the presidency. The Republicans drew the proper conclusions, and so that in 1868 they passed the 14th Amendment, which made black people citizens, allegedly. Still, the racial terror goes on. Blacks are prevented from voting. Then they must pass the 15th Amendment in 1870 to guarantee blacks the right to vote. You then have more murder, more mayhem, a final compromise in 1877. And you have a reign of terror in the South. You have to remember that until almost the dawn of World War, the vast majority of black people lived in the South. Right? So we had elected some 2 senators between 1870 and 1900, and 20 black congressmen, all from the South, of course. But then they were all disenfranchised. So what you're asking is that beginning in 1890 and for the next 50 years, what you have is the Jim Crow. You've kicked black people out of the political process, and now you establish structural racial hierarchy. You prevent them from voting. The Supreme Court declares segregation legal, separate but equal.